My sister was the medical miracle, who received my bone marrow twice. When she tries to ruin my marriage out of spite, I find our mother's hidden journals. I wasn't her savior. I was a spare created in a lab specifically to keep her alive. The glass didn't just break. It shattered into 1,000 jagged reminders of why I was never allowed to be the center of attention. My sister, Maya, stood over the ruins of my favorite wedding vase, her hand pressed to her throat in that practiced gesture of sudden frailty she used whenever the spotlight drifted too far from her. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," she gasped, her voice thinning into a reed-like whistle that instantly brought my husband, David, running from the next room. I just got so lightheaded. The world just tilted. Before I could utter a single word of frustration, David was already guiding her to the sofa, his face etched with the kind of terror one usually reserves for a glass doll about to splinter. I stood there with the broom in my hand, a ghost in my own living room, watching them cater to the woman who had spent my entire life consuming my oxygen. Maya was the medical miracle, the child who had stared down leukemia twice and won. In our house, her survival wasn't just a blessing. It was a religion, and I was the silent acolyte expected to sacrifice everything at her altar. I grew up in the sterile silence of oncology wards, the smell of rubbing alcohol and industrial floor wax seeping into my skin until it felt like a part of my DNA. When she relapsed for the second time, the world as I knew it ended. I was only 10 years old, sitting on a high hospital bed with my legs dangling, listening to a doctor explain that I was the key to her life. They used words like hero and savior, but all I felt was the biting cold of the air conditioning and the terrifying weight of a responsibility I never asked for. I remember the morning of the second harvest with a clarity that still makes my bones ache. The prep room was a cage of stainless steel and fluorescent lights that flickered with a rhythmic hum. I looked for my mother, hoping for a hug or a word of comfort, but she was already in the room next door, weeping over Maya's hand, promising her that everything would be okay because I was there to fix it. When the anesthesia finally took hold, it felt like falling into a dark, bottomless well. I woke up hours later in a recovery bay, my lower back feeling as though it had been pierced by a hot iron. The pain was a dull, throbbing roar that moved with every heartbeat. I called out for a drink of water, my throat parched and raw, but the only person who came was a tired nurse I didn't know. My parents were through the glass partition, their backs to me, focused entirely on the monitor tracking Maya's vitals. I was the bridge they had crossed to get to her, and once they reached the other side they had no reason to look back. As we grew older, that dynamic didn't change. It simply evolved into something more sinister. When I met David, I felt like I was finally stepping out of the hospital shadows and into the sun. But Maya viewed my marriage not as my happiness, but as a theft of her resources. The silent infiltration began almost immediately after the honeymoon. It started with the emergency phone calls at 3 in the morning. David would bolt upright, heart racing, only to find Maya on the line claiming she had a strange tightness in her chest. We would spend 4 hours in an emergency room waiting area, only for the tests to come back perfectly clear. "It must have been a panic attack," she would sigh, leaning her head on David's shoulder while I sat across from them, simmering with a resentment I was told was selfish. She knew exactly which buttons to push to make David feel like a protector and make me look like a cold, unfeeling sister. She began to move through my life like a slow-moving rot, subtly undermining the foundation of my home. During a high-stakes Sunday brunch with David's law firm partners, Maya managed to turn a conversation about my recent promotion into a eulogy for her own lost potential. "I'm so glad Sarah has the energy for such a demanding career," she said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "I always tell her how lucky she is that I was the one who got sick so she could stay strong and healthy for the both of us. It must be so nice not to have to worry about your body failing you every day." I saw the partners exchange glances, their respect for my professional drive replaced by a patronizing pity. She wasn't just sharing her story, she was branding me as the lucky one, who owed the world a debt for my own health. The spite reached a fever pitch when I caught her in my home office one afternoon. I had been working on a complex digital archive for a client, months of research and meticulous coding. When I walked in, she was sitting at my desk, my laptop open. "I was just trying to help you organize your desktop, Sarah. It looked so cluttered and I know how stressed you get," she chirped. Before I could stop her, she clicked empty trash. My heart stopped. Years of work vanished in a click. When I screamed, actually screamed, At her to get out, she didn't apologize. She didn't even look guilty. She simply gripped the edge of the desk, let out a soft theatrical moan, and slid to the floor in a fainting spell. David walked in to find me hovering over her, shaking with rage, while she lay there looking like a broken bird. To David, I wasn't a victim of sabotage. I was the aggressive sister who had pushed a fragile woman to her limit. The final straw came during our mother's 70th birthday garden party. The lawn was decorated with white lilies, Maya's favorite, and the air was filled with the polite clinking of champagne flutes. Maya stood up to give the main toast, but instead of honoring our mother, she turned her tear-streaked face toward me. "I want to thank Sarah," she sobbed softly, "for everything she used to do for me. I know my illness is a burden, and I know that since she got married, she doesn't have much room left in her heart for a sick sister. I'm so sorry, Sarah, for being the reason you're so unhappy." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother looked at me with a cold, sharp disappointment that cut deeper than any surgeon's knife. David looked away, embarrassed by the public spectacle. Unable to stay and endure the judging whispers of our family friends, I retreated into the house. I ended up in the attic, a place filled with the ghosts of our childhood. I was looking for old photo albums, desperate to find some proof that I was more than just Maya's shadow. I pushed aside boxes of old medical records and discarded toys until I found my mother's old mahogany vanity, tucked away like a shameful secret. The vanity was locked, the wood swollen with age. I grabbed a metal ruler and forced the drawer open, the wood splintering with a sharp crack. Inside, hidden beneath a layer of yellowed lace, were 3 leather-bound journals. I opened the first one, expecting to see a mother's diary of hope and fear. Instead, the first page was dated 3 years before my birth. My breath hitched as I read the clinical, detached entries. There were no mentions of a second child or growing our family. Instead, the pages were filled with data, genetic screening results, donor compatibility charts, embryo 4B, perfect match. I sat on the cold attic floor as the world shifted on its axis. My mother hadn't prayed for me. She had ordered me. I wasn't a daughter conceived in love. I was a subject created in a laboratory, a biological insurance policy designed to provide spare parts for the golden child downstairs. The journals detailed every penny spent to ensure I would be the perfect harvest. I wasn't her savior. I was her property. The attic air felt like it was thickening, turning into something heavy and hard to swallow as I stared at the words, Subject Gen 2. The dust motes dancing in the sliver of moonlight through the gabled window looked like static, the world breaking apart into a million tiny pieces. I didn't get up. I couldn't. I stayed slumped against the mahogany vanity, the leather journal heavy in my lap, and I began to read. I read until my legs went numb, and then I read until the sun began to bleed through the horizon, casting a cold gray light over my mother's betrayal. The journals weren't diaries of a mother's love. They were blueprints. Page after page detailed trips to a clinic in Cyprus, far away from the prying eyes of local medical boards. My mother had written down the costs of genetic optimization, with the same detachment she used for her grocery lists. March 14th. 3rd round of implantation scheduled. The doctors assure us that this cycle will produce a high-yield match. We cannot afford another failure like the last one. My stomach churned. There had been failures before me? Was I simply the one that finally worked? She described my very existence as a biological insurance policy, a phrase she underlined twice in red ink. I wasn't conceived in a moment of passion or a desire for another child to hold. I was a vessel, a reservoir of healthy cells designed to be tapped whenever Maya's body faltered. The clinical detachment in her writing, referring to me as the resource or the safeguard, stripped away every warm memory I ever had of her. As the morning light grew stronger, my entire childhood began to shift and warp, like a film reel melting under a hot lamp. Everything I thought was protection was actually preservation. I remembered being 7 years old and crying because all my friends were joining the local soccer league. My mother had knelt down, her face stern, and told me, "No, Sarah. You're too precious. We can't risk any internal injuries." At the time, I thought she was just an overprotective mother who loved me too much. Now, looking at the journal entries from that same month, I saw the truth. Must ensure Gen 2 avoids high-impact activities. We need her organs in peak condition in case Maya's kidneys show further distress. I wasn't too precious to lose. I was too valuable to damage. A specific memory surfaced, sharp and painful. I was 9, playing in the driveway when I tripped and tore a deep gash into my knee on a jagged piece of gravel. I was bleeding, sobbing from the shock and the sting. My mother had rushed out of the house, her face pale with a terror I had always interpreted as concern for my pain. But she didn't pick me up. She didn't kiss the wound. She grabbed my leg with a grip that left bruises and hissed, "What have you done? We cannot have you getting an infection right now. Do you have any idea how dangerous this is for Maya if your blood is compromised?" She wasn't worried about my scar. She was worried about the purity of the supply. I realized then that I had spent my life as a curated product, a piece of high-end equipment kept in a climate-controlled box until it was needed for the real child. I flipped to the back of the third journal and felt the air leave my lungs again. There was a loose piece of notebook paper folded neatly. It was a letter written in Maya's loopy, elegant cursive, dated 10 years ago, just after her second recovery. "Mom, I found the Cypress files in the safe," it began. At first I was scared, but then I realized how much you must love me to create a whole person just to save me. "Don't worry, I won't tell Sarah. It's better if she thinks she's doing it out of love. It makes her more willing to give." The betrayal was total. Maya hadn't just been a passive recipient of my marrow. She was a silent partner in my exploitation. This was why she felt she could delete my files, insult my career, and ruin my marriage. In her mind, I was literally made for her. She didn't see my happiness as something I earned. She saw it as a resource I was stealing from her. Every moment I spent focusing on my husband or my job was, in her eyes, a moment I wasn't fulfilling my primary function as her support system. Her spite wasn't a personality flaw. It was a sense of ownership. By noon, I knew I couldn't stay in that attic any longer. I moved with a cold, mechanical precision. I went downstairs, washed the dust from my face, and called my mother. "I'm coming over for tea," I said, my voice steady enough to surprise me. "Just the two of us." When I arrived at her house, the smell of jasmine tea and lemon cake felt like a lie. My mother sat across from me in her sun-drenched parlor, looking every bit the graceful matriarch. She started in on her usual script, the one she'd recited for 30 years. "It's so good to see you, Sarah. Especially with Maya feeling so frail lately. You know, your birth was such a miracle for this family. You were our little angel sent from heaven." I watched her pour the tea, her movements fluid and practiced. I waited until she raised her cup to her lips, and then I spoke. "Tell me, Mom, did the clinic in Cyprus provide a warranty on subject Gen 2? Or was the HLA matching guaranteed regardless of the implantation cycle?" The silence that followed was absolute. The teacup froze halfway to her mouth. I watched as the blood drained from her face, leaving her looking old and hollow. The cup began to rattle against the saucer, a frantic metallic clinking that filled the room. She didn't deny it. She didn't ask how I knew. She just set the cup down with a trembling hand and looked out the window. "We were going to lose her, Sarah," she whispered, her voice devoid of the warmth she usually performed. "You weren't there for the first 3 years. You didn't see her wasting away. Any mother would have done what I did. I gave you a life. A good life. All I asked in return was that you help keep your sister alive. Is that really such a tragedy?" "You didn't give me a life," I replied, my voice a low, dangerous hum. "You designed a tool. You lied to me every time I went under that needle. You let me believe I was a hero when you really thought I was a faucet you could just turn on whenever Maya felt thirsty." She looked at me then, and for the first time I saw the true hardness in her. "And look at you. Healthy, strong, married. You wouldn't even exist if it wasn't for her illness. You should be thanking her." I stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the hardwood. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. The spare inside me had finally broken, and in its place was a woman who was done being used. I walked out of that house without looking back, but I didn't go home to hide. I went home to prepare. That evening, David found me in the living room with the journals spread out across the coffee table. I told him everything. I showed him the receipts, the genetic charts, and Maya's letter. I saw the horror dawn on his face, the way his jaw tightened as he realized how he had been manipulated into helping them guilt-trip me. He didn't ask me to forgive them. He didn't tell me family is family. He just took my hand and asked, "What do you want to do?" "I'm going to take photos of every single page," I said, pulling out my phone. "I'm going to digitize the ledger of my debt. And then I'm going to show them what happens when the spare decides she doesn't belong to the machine anymore. I began snapping photos, the flash of the camera illuminating the clinical notes of my creation. With every click I felt a cord severing. I wasn't going to fight them with screams or tantrums. I was going to use the one thing they valued most: my cooperation. I was going to withdraw my services entirely. No more marrow. No more blood. No more miracles. I was going to become a ghost to them, but first I was going to make sure they understood that the bank was closed forever. The phone didn't just ring. It vibrated against the mahogany coffee table like a warning bell. I looked down at the caller ID, Maya. Only 2 days had passed since I walked out of my mother's house, yet here she was, right on schedule. I didn't let it go to voicemail. I picked it up, feeling the cool glass of the phone against my ear, and heard that familiar breathy sigh. Sarah? I'm so glad you answered. I've been feeling so sluggish and the doctor thinks my counts are dipping again. He mentioned a booster procedure. Just a minor top-up. I'm sure you don't mind coming in on Thursday, right? In the past, that tone would have sent me into a tailspin of guilt. Today it felt like hearing a poorly rehearsed play. I looked at David, who was sitting across from me, his face a mask of quiet resolve. I took a slow, deep breath. Actually, Maya, I've been thinking about everything. About the garden party, our family, and how tense things have been. Why don't you and Mom come over for dinner this Friday? I want to make a grand announcement. I think it's time we settle everything for good. There was a pause on the other end, a flicker of surprise followed by a smug, audible smile. Oh, Sarah. That's wonderful. I knew you'd see reason. We'll be there at 7. She hung up, likely already planning how she'd spend the evening basking in my apology. Friday arrived with a heavy, overcast sky. I spent the afternoon in the kitchen, not with the frantic energy of someone trying to please, but with the cold precision of a chess player. I prepared a roast, the aroma filling the house, and set the table with my finest linens. But under the decorative chargers I didn't place napkins. I placed thick manila envelopes. When the doorbell rang, the air in the foyer felt electric. My mother entered first, wearing her disappointed but forgiving expression, followed by Maya, who was draped in a thick pashmina, playing the part of the fading flower to perfection. It smells lovely, Sarah, my mother remarked, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of my supposed instability. They sat down with the practiced ease of people who believed they owned the space. The dinner began in a suffocating silence, broken only by the clink of silverware. Maya started to talk about her discomfort, leaning into David as if she might slide off her chair at any moment. I just hope the procedure on Thursday isn't too taxing for either of us, she said, looking at me with those wide, predatory eyes. I didn't answer. Instead, I stood up and walked to the head of the table. I promised an announcement, I said, my voice cutting through her monologue like a blade. But before that, I want you to open the envelopes under your plates. My mother frowned, reaching down and pulling out the stack of papers. As she slid the first page out, a high-resolution photo of the Cyprus Clinic invoice, the color left her face in a visible tide. Maya followed suit, her fingers trembling as she pulled out the copy of her own teenage letter. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. I watched Maya's eyes dart across the clinical descriptions of embryo 4B and genetic harvesting schedule. The miracle child looked like she'd been struck. The biological bank is closed, I said, my voice calm and devoid of the tremor they expected. I've spent the last 48 hours with a lawyer and a new medical team. I have legally barred both of you from my medical records. I have revoked every power of attorney document I ever signed in your favor. If I am ever in an accident, you won't even be allowed in the room, let alone allowed to authorize a donation. Sarah, you're being hysterical, my mother hissed, though her eyes stayed glued to the evidence of her own handwriting. We did this for the family. You can't just walk away from your sister. She needs you to survive. She needs a donor, I corrected. And she can find one through the proper public channels like everyone else. I am no longer your subject Gen 2. I am a woman who was manufactured to be a spare part, and I'm officially retiring. I leaned over the table, looking Maya directly in the eye. I know you knew, Maya. I saw the letter. You didn't love me, you managed me. You treated my life like a trust fund you were entitled to spend. Maya's facade finally cracked. The fainting bird vanished, replaced by a sharp, jagged spite. "You're nothing without us," she screamed, slamming her hands on the table. "You wouldn't even be here if I hadn't gotten sick. You owe me your very breath." "That's where you're wrong," I said. "The debt is paid. In full. And here is the price of your silence." I tapped the journal sitting by my elbow. "If either of you contacts me or David or my employer again, if you so much as whisper a lie about my marriage, these journals go to the medical board and the press. The world will know that the Miracle Maya story was actually a dark back-alley experiment. I wonder how your social circle will feel when they realize you didn't survive through grace, but through a laboratory order." My mother looked at the papers as if they were poisonous. She knew I wasn't bluffing. She saw the spare, had finally grown a spine made of the very iron she tried to harvest. They left in a whirlwind of hushed, panicked arguments, the door clicking shut behind them with a finality that made my lungs feel 3 sizes larger. In the weeks that followed, David and I didn't stay to watch the fallout. We sold the house, blocked every number, and moved 3 states away to a small town where the air didn't smell like hospital corridors. We didn't tell anyone where we were going. It was a rebirth in the truest sense. I started doing things I was never allowed to do. I bought a pair of high-impact running shoes. The first time I ran 5 miles, feeling the rhythmic pound of my feet on the pavement and the burn in my lungs, I cried. Not from pain but from the sheer, exhilarating joy of knowing that this heart, these lungs, and this marrow belonged to me. I wasn't preserving them for someone else's crisis. I was using them for my own life. Now, a year later, I sit in my garden. It's early morning and the dew is still clinging to the lavender. There are no miracles here, just the slow, honest growth of things that are tended to with genuine love. I think about my mother and Maya sometimes, but the thoughts no longer have hooks. I realize now that family isn't a biological contract signed in a lab. It's the choice to see a person as a whole, messy, independent being. I look down at my hands. They are scarred from the old harvests, but they are strong. They no longer shake. I am the author of the chapters that come next, and for the first time in my life, I'm not writing them in the margins of someone else's medical chart. I am whole. I am sovereign. And I am finally beautifully alone.